They say that in politics, sometimes for weeks nothing happens, and sometimes in a day weeks happen. Well, we recently had that here in South Africa when when the ongoing budget debacle finally blew up, where the DA refused to support the ANC's budget proposals of raising money through VAT and not cutting expenditure, and it all seemed to hang in the balance until in swooped the Action SA with their capes. They came to the rescue of the ANC to pass the fiscal framework, and joining us today from Action SA is Comrade Michael Beaumont. Michael, well done in scooping that particular one. You guys have come in as the white knight to rescue South Africa, is that right?
Well, I think I might take a few differences of opinion with your analysis, if you don't mind, Mike. But the important part to see is that South Africa was facing an unprecedented budget crisis. And for all of the problems that South Africans have endured in government, and let's agree there have been many, instability has not yet been one of those. Say what you like about bad ANC governance over the last 30 years, and it would be true, but budgets were passed and the processes of government took place on time.
Okay, so sorry to interrupt. You'd expect nothing less. So you're saying that that stability was a good thing, because in 30 years we've seen an unprecedented decline in South Africa during that stability. You're saying that instability, which challenges that stability that allowed the country to nosedive, is a bad thing.
Well, look, instability is always a bad thing. Let's understand that.
Why?
Well, just got to give me a chance to respond to some of these questions, Mark. I think I'm still on the first question.
Okay.
But the point is this. ANC governance in the last 30 years has undoubtedly been bad. And it has brought the country to a point where there's very little resilience in the economic system, and small things can trigger major consequences economically. One of those things we are looking at now is an unprecedented budget crisis in South Africa, a very real situation where the markets and the currency respond very negatively to a situation where we have complete uncertainty around the fiscal framework and the budget, where governments are unable to actually plan for their long-term infrastructure spending. Municipalities and provinces right now are out there consulting upon budgets through their IDPs, and yet they actually don't know what the final picture is going to look like. And this is a level of uncertainty we haven't had in our country before. Now, please understand what I'm saying. I'm not holding up a candle for 30 years of failed ANC government. I'm saying that we didn't have that kind of instability in the last 30 years, and we do now. And where I'll also disagree with you, if you don't mind as well, Mike, is that the DA's approach to these negotiations has been atrocious, because they haven't approached the budget negotiations on the budget. They have approached the budget negotiations on the basis of trying to secure other levers of power within the GNU, associated with legislation that has been passed and other things, and have not dealt with it at the level of the budget. Now, they've had 9 months in government to address these issues, and they should have negotiated these things up front before entering the GNU and electing a president. What they are doing is using the budget as an internal political power play within the GNU, and quite frankly, at the expense of the South African people. Because the markets are going to respond to an unprecedented budget crisis. You can see what the markets and the currency have done just in the last week, because the markets look to the two biggest parties in the GNU to provide leadership, and that is not happening. And we're sitting there as an opposition political party who isn't in this government, who isn't driving around in blue lights and the like. And we're saying we have the ability to enter this and to try and drive a bargain for the South African people that also gives them a budget and provides that level of certainty, even if it is an imperfect budget, but to end a political stalemate. And that's the choice that we have chosen to pursue.
Now, let's start off with, you say that should have been negotiated before going into the GNU. Well, we do know that circumstance precluded that from happening, right? And an agreement was hammered out.
Can I interrupt you for a moment?
Yes, please.
Cool. So from my point of view, I don't accept that premise at all. There were 2 weeks between an election of the country and an election of the president. And the truth is, all these GNU partners did was negotiate who was going to get what minister and who was going to get what deputy minister in 2 weeks. That can't be acceptable. And I say this, Mike, because I have traveled around the world to places where coalitions are the cornerstone of their democracies, Germany, Denmark, a variety of places, with the very leaders of these political parties in the GNU. And the first learning in every one of those experiences is you have to negotiate up front. You have to negotiate beyond who gets what position. And you need to get to the point of a shared program of action. In the South African context, that was so much more obvious because 30 years of the ANC governance, you were correctly rolling your eyes about a minute ago, has caused a breakdown in the lines between party and state so fundamentally that the entire state is ANC. And unless you're going to negotiate reforms up front and negotiate a program through which those political reforms find expression in the administration, you're going to have this inertia where the departments continue to do what they've always done. You will not achieve any reforms. And quite frankly, this is why 9 months in, the GNU has just become an implementing agency of the ANC. Now, my deepest sympathies to those parties in the GNU that didn't have the intellect to know any of these things when they were negotiating. But the reality is the South African people cannot pay for their political failures with a budget crisis. And that's the point of view that we adopted.
Yeah. And I'd say it's time for the GNU to go. I think that's become pretty clear because, and I suppose we could go around. I suppose neither of us were in the room, but agreements were certainly done. I've seen some of the paperwork of those agreements. And I do understand that the DA's actions now are as a consequence of the ANC not sticking to the agreement as made.
I'm not sure what agreements you're referring to. The only document that we ever saw, and you must bear in mind, Mike, we were invited to join the GNU, and we were presented with all of the documents, as you'll see now where I'm air quoting that. And effectively what it was the statement of intent. And the statement of intent is the most ridiculous document in the history of documents, because it is so broad that every single person from the extreme nuts on one side to the extreme nuts on the other side can fully agree to everything in that document and have completely different understandings as to what it means.
Yeah.
Because it makes statements like, we need inclusive economic growth. Well, I mean, find me a South African who doesn't want that.
Sure.
How are we going to achieve that? And that's where the points of difference have clearly emerged within the GNU, and that, in my opinion, is the most fundamental failure. Because unless you're going to actually sit down and say, these are the reforms that we want to achieve, and this is how we're going to translate that political direction into an administration that otherwise will just continue doing what it's done before, the GNU was always going to be ill-fated. And it's just astonishing that people in that GNU, knowing full well the nature of the ANC and their difficulties in accepting that they are no longer a majority party, just went in there like lemmings.
Okay, so would you then say, knowing what you know, that your support of the ANC is not doing exactly the same thing?
I think we need to be clear. We're not supporting the ANC. The ANC is a political party. We don't support them. They are an independent party, as are we. What we have done is we've entered a budget process to say we are willing to put our votes on the table to ensure that this budget doesn't become a political football within the GNU in which South Africans are going to pay the cost of economic fallouts in our markets and our currency falling apart at a time in which there's very little resilience for these kind of changes in our economy right now. And we are willing to extract conditions in exchange for that, which is what the GNU should have done, could have done, and didn't do, and to ensure that those conditions are serving the South African people. And those conditions we put on the table initially had a very long list. But what we came to realize is that in the late stage at which this budget is, and it's very late. You must remember, this budget was meant to be presented in the kind of first half of February. It wasn't. Then it had to be presented on the 12th of March. And we are now on the 1st of April committee meetings this week where everything's falling apart. So these are serious delays that impact the entire timeline around these things. And we are saying, if you take the approach of passing the amendments that the DA and others were proposing to do, it goes right back to the beginning again, and the process starts again. Now, that works for the DA because they are happy to use this as a political lever of power within the GNU. If they send the finance minister back to the beginning, they can extract what they want to extract from him and do so in a stronger position of negotiation. But the South African people are paying for that with the fallout of that level of uncertainty, and we couldn't tolerate that. And that's why we put our votes on the table and say, providing you are willing to remove at minimum the VAT increase and the income tax bracket creep, which in my opinion is even more serious than the VAT increase, then we are not willing to support you.
So let's go into that. Let's talk about, I must admit, the one thing that I was most excited about with Enoch Godongwana, who I must admit gets way too much credit for a guy who's been discredited and should probably be in jail, to be our finance minister boggles belief. I mean, the guy basically, was fingered in taking 120 million rand from a pension fund for clothing workers, and everybody seems to be okay with that. But I thought one of the best suggestions was the increase in VAT, because I'm one of those South Africans, as are you, as are most people watching us, who get taxed at least twice for just about our entire existence.
Yes.
Being, there's education, but we pay extra education. There's health services, but we have to pay security and so on. But we have to, we pay the government, but then we have to get private services as well. And I thought that it was a very, very good idea to spread the tax net, because, there's no attempt to broaden the tax net, because even the proposals that I heard through Athol Trollip and a few other people has been that you want to extract more money out of the economy by SARS doing what Shamila Batoy does, saying, I can't do my job unless you give me more money. Saying that there's a magical 800 billion rand that he's going to collect in taxes, right? Now, if that gets extracted out of the economy, there'll be even less money in the economy. I'm just wondering how this works, you know what I mean? Because it doesn't make economic sense to me, and I've worked in finance.
So let's deal with this in two different ways. I think the first thing is to understand the idea that VAT, as opposed to other taxes, has particular appeals in terms of how easy it is to be collected and how indiscriminate it is certainly one part of the argument for some. I think from our point of view, it's not about that. It's not about which tax is better than another tax. It's about saying the South African people are fed up of being taxed. Going back to the point that you're raising, the amount of tax that people are paying through many different ways. I'm not even talking about the obvious things through income tax and corporate tax and VAT, etc. But the way people are having to spend more and more every day to compensate for the failures of government has become debilitating for the South African people. And I think the best expression to describe it, even if not a financial term, is gatvol. People are just gatvol. And particularly what is getting to people is that they pay these taxes and there's very little value in return they're seeing. But what they are seeing is a government that's living large. I mean, this GNU, let me tell you, is making previous governments look austere in its approach.
Yeah.
I mean, 200 million rand in international travel in 8 months.
Yeah.
I mean, these guys are jetting around the world trying to set a new record. The biggest cabinet in history, 43 deputy ministers. If you can ever get one of them on your show, Mike, to tell us what value they provide, I would love to hear the answer to that question. And they're just really continuing where the ANC left off and taking it to a new level. Now, I think South Africans are looking at this saying, we're drawing a line in the sand, this far and no more. We aren't willing to pay.
Okay, but
and that's the message we've received from our structures, and that's why we've drawn that line in the sand ourselves in this particular debate.
But now, you were just...
sorry, Mike, there was a second part to your question.
Sorry.
So forgive me.
Yeah.
These two parts has always become a thing. But the answer is there's actually a lot of places where this money can be found. And you ridicule it, but you shouldn't. Because the SARS 800 billion that is being referred to is very much there. And it is not about additional taxes being imposed. It's about going after the people who are defaulting on their SARS obligations. And there are many, many people who have been doing so for a long time. And as you know, it has been a political program of particular governments in recent past to cripple SARS's ability to go after the politically connected elite because of the webs of corruption that have taken place in those particular environments. And there's very real numbers and credibility behind the SARS Commissioner's claim that those monies are available. There are high-level IT systems that have the ability to be able to investigate claims, because at the core of this is if Michael says he earns X a year and he says that to SARS, on what basis does SARS really have to challenge that? And there are systems that SARS can procure to be able to investigate those claims far more thoroughly. But even if you just take it down to what's on the table right now and not pie in the sky, there is 50 billion rands worth of collections that SARS is ready to pursue right now. And if we're going to start somewhere, let's start with the people who've been evading tax. But then secondly, Let's talk about cutting the expenditure of the state. This is a 2
100%.
trillion rand budget. Are you saying that 13 billion rand is beyond the ability of those in charge of our budget to make those cuts? Let's start with cabinet. Let's get rid of deputy ministers. Let's put an embargo on international travel unless there's a very clear business case that can be made for it. Let's ensure that we cut down on ministerial housing and blue lights. There are so many parts of our budget. The seaters are sitting on billions and billions of rands, and no one can tell you what value these things add. The wastage in our country is beyond imagination. If you think what America's exposing through their Doge campaigns, etc., say what you like about them, can you imagine that in the South African context, what we would find here?
Yeah, but what we do know is Fikile and Balula saying that the DA wants us to cut. We are not a party that cut. We will not cut. So how are you going to get him to change his instruction to his minions that they'll cut expenditure? I'm saying that they have taken that off the table. That's what got us to this particular problem.
I think the big thing that the ANC needs to hear from someone, and if Action SA is going to be the someone to say this, that's great, is it's not their table anymore. It used to be their table.
Okay, so why was it wrong when the DA said that?
Say again?
Why was it wrong when the DA said that?
I don't think it was wrong. The DA is correct to make the assertion that the ANC continues to try and govern like they have a majority. I think that analysis is correct. Of course, it's not helpful because they've gone ahead and enabled that by producing a coalition agreement that is entirely meaningless and forces zero reforms, and now want to leverage those in at the last minute. But I think the difference of opinion is this. If Action SA is going to consider its role going forward, we have said we will allow the passage of this framework right now on the condition that the VAT and income tax gets removed. If they don't get removed, we vote it down. And if you look at the numbers in the South African Parliament, and when you consider that the ANC right now is effectively a minority government, very keen to stay out of coalition with the EFF and MK, Action SA plays a pivotal role in that regard. And even those other parties outside of the GNU are lining up to vote against VAT and income tax increases because everyone sees that as an unfair punishment on the South African people for a government that has demonstrated it doesn't care.
So, Michael, now tell me, how can anybody believe you? Because if I'm not mistaken, we heard the same words from you and when I had your newly installed speaker in the city of Johannesburg here, saying you're going to hold the ANC to account in Johannesburg or you're going to walk away. Right? The first thing that they did was vote an increase for the mayoral committee, right, which was backed by your speaker. We now have Johannesburg where we're about to have a 13.9% increase in water and sanitation tariffs, a 12.74% increase in electricity tariffs, 6.6% in refuse collection tariffs, 4.6% in property rates tariffs. This doesn't sound like you're holding anybody to account.
Far from the truth, actually. If you look at the adjustment budget in February, Action SA voted against the adjustment budget, against threats of motions of no confidence, etc. And we did so unashamedly because we entered that arrangement in the legislature, Mark, not the executive. So we can't be governing in the executive. We can't change those decisions ourselves. And accountability can only achieve so much. Accountability, as you've witnessed in the last 30 years of the DA and opposition, can't fix the problems of government, but it can expose them and hold their feet to the fire and apply pressure. And that's exactly what we've done. So if you look at the adjustment budget, we voted against that adjustment budget because it reneged on the promise to remove the 230 Rand surcharge on prepaid electricity users. And if you give us the opportunity again, we'll do it tomorrow. As it relates to the budget that's just been tabled, we don't like the budget. It wasn't consulted with upon us, and we've issued a statement saying, if you bring this back, you're going to be in trouble, because we will not support those kind of increases because they are uncaring and they do not reflect the sentiment of a city that is getting the least value for its money compared to many others, including national government. But if you want to talk about Action SA in respect to this particular concern, let's talk about the city of Tshwane, where we are in the executive and we're leading the executive in the position of mayor, because we've just tabled a budget for public consultation that has achieved the following. It has reduced the rates randage by 4% because there's a new valuation role that has dealt with the last 4 years of property values going up. It has absorbed increases from Rand Water and City Power. So even though they passed on 12 and 14% increases respectively, the city absorbed some of that rather than passing it on in full and imposing our own to the residents of Tshwane. It is a budget that borrows 0 Rand at all to fund its operations. It is the first budget to be fully funded in the city since 2021 and actually has a surplus after having a city that's been basically bankrupt over the last number of years. And it puts 70% of the budget behind infrastructure renewal, repairs and maintenance.
Okay, so
that is the Action SA brand in government. And certainly what is happening in the executive in Johannesburg just demonstrates how good Action SA is in the executive in Tshwane.
Okay, but to take this back now to the national picture, you're not in the executive in the country. So therefore, all of your actions are going to be treated very much like your recommendations in Johannesburg, saying, thank you, we'll come back to you, and then and then the residents of the citizens of South Africa, much like the residents of Johannesburg, will be sitting there holding the pot up, while our officials get more and more money and more and more dirty deals get done.
Quite the opposite. If you look at the numbers in Joburg, the issues in Joburg is that the coalition that is in place in the executive in Johannesburg has a majority, and it has a majority without Action SA. And I think that's the vital difference that we're talking about here. So at the end of the day, they can govern and pass things that we fundamentally disagree with, as we have in the past, and we will vote against those things because we don't agree with them. We are not bound to vote with that coalition in any regard, and we are operating on an issue-by-issue basis. If it's meritorious, we'll support. If it's not, we will oppose. What we're looking at in the national parliament is a very different equation, because the GNU had 287 seats. The DA has pulled the plug, seemingly, on its 87. So now the GN, I'm not sure if you can really refer to the U anymore, has 200. It needs one more seat to be able to govern. Action SA has 6 seats. So we have the ability to leverage our support for real reforms, or, let's be clear, Mike, withdraw it.
Yeah.
And we've been very clear that if those increases remain part of this budget, we're not going to provide that support, and we will play tough in the way that GNU partners, quite frankly, haven't.
So you don't feel that you're going to be treated exactly the same as the DA? Because I hear a similar story whenever I speak to somebody from the DA, where they say, come and look at Cape Town, come and look at how well we run Western Cape, etc., where they're getting drilled deluxe in the GNU and any other place that they co-govern where they don't have a majority. So you're talking about the city of Tshwane working where you are in power with a coalition that's holding, and you touting your successes, much like the DA touts their successes in the Western Cape. But everywhere else you say, well, that's not us, because we're not in, and we can't.
No, look, I think you've got to be fair, and there's a fundamental error in your analysis, if you'll allow me to put it that way, is that the DA is involved in governments in many, many places. Action SA is not. Action SA is literally, at municipal level, governing in the executive in only one municipality in South Africa, and that is in Tshwane, where we actually lead that municipality with a mayor. And that is why it offers a very fair brand, not just for the Action SA brand of government, but our ability to play within the team sport, which is coalitions. And I think that's an interesting point, Mike, that there needs to be more analysis of going forward, because in many ways, the DA has become like that political party, or like that kid in the playground, is a better analogy, who, as an individual sport, does really well in certain regards, in certain places perhaps, but better than the ANC in other regards. But when you put them in a team environment, it doesn't work. Now, if you are saying that you can't govern effectively in a team environment in South Africa where coalitions are the new norm, and more places are going to be under coalition arrangements going forward, the analogy of the Western Cape or Cape Town really is irrelevant for the rest of the country.
So your Tshwane analogy is irrelevant to the rest of the country?
You couldn't have missed the point further unless you were trying. In other words, the city of Tshwane analogy is a perfect analogy for a political party that's put its hand up and says, we are relevant to the coalition future of the country, because we were in a failing coalition to which we had attached ourselves at the hip, come hell or high water. We went through our Damascene moment to realize that we can't do that. We need to be pragmatic. And if a better arrangement can be put in place, we can't say we won't work with this or won't work with that. We need to be available for the best arrangement that delivers. We entered that arrangement. We're leading that arrangement. It is stable and it is delivering. And there's a hell of a long way to go. I don't want to ever be one of those people who says, we've arrived. Far from it. But real improvements are taking place that are now incontrovertible. They're there. You can see them. Now, the reason I'm using that example is because the coalition environment in local government, or let's say even nationally now, is so messy and will become increasingly messy that South Africans need to ask themselves, not only do I like this political party, its leaders, its policies, but can they play a team sport?
Yeah.
Can they be effective in an environment where they might have to work with people who they don't like, with whom they don't have much in common, but can work in my collective interests? And Action SA is demonstrating that we can do that.
Yes.
And the DA is demonstrating that they can't. As a matter of fact, one of the interesting things that really should become a point of analysis going forward right now is, notwithstanding the DA's 20-odd% of the vote that they have countrywide, is in an environment where coalitions are the future, which political parties in the next few months are going to be willing to work with the DA? Because all of the parties that were in the MPC witnessed the DA that used the MPC to decampaign their partners. All of the parties in the GNU have said that the DA has gone in there and ridden roughshod over everyone's opinion and acted like children throughout this process. The ANC is looking like it's about to draw the line in the sand in respect of the DA. So the DA very rapidly is going to be that kid in the corner sitting there waiting for the next election because this election didn't deliver a majority. The news flash here is that no election is going to deliver a majority for a very long time going forward. And the team sport of coalition politics requires a team mentality.
So by your using your logic, are you saying that the problem is the DA being a bad team sport player, not the ANC?
Oh, no. I think
so
that
you're
would
saying
be
that
incorrect.
so you are saying everything's the DA's fault, not the ANC's fault.
No, far from it.
Because they seem to be the worst team player of the lot. And we've got mountains of evidence of how bad they are as a coalition partner, but yet you seem to give them a free ride.
Not at all. In fact, if you remember,
So everybody's
earlier,
bad except for you.
No, far from it. And I think we need to realize that in a political industry, there are no angels. Every political party has vices and virtues, and you need to find ways of working with them in a way that benefits the South African people. But to go back to your point, we're certainly not saying that the DA has been the entire
Well, you
problem.
spent 20 minutes telling me how bad the DA are as a coalition partner and nothing about the ANC.
Well, Mike, if you go back a second, your question was about comparing the DA in Cape Town versus Action SA in Tshwane. So you create the comparison between the two parties and then say to me, I'm talking about the DA too much. If you don't want to talk about the DA, let's talk about something else.
Let's talk
but
about
you're the
the
one
ANC.
posing the questions. And earlier you will recall that I indicated regarding the ANC that they are still governing like they haven't accepted an election result. And there is a problem in that regard. And that is why a coalition agreement needed to be constructed that genuinely saw power sharing and not just the implementation of ANC policies. So I've been quite clear about those particular failures.
Okay, so let's circle back to the budget issue where you have sort of put forward this idea: no increase in VAT, no bracket creep on income tax. We find the money, give money to SARS. You mentioned that SARS need to be capacitated so that they can go after illicit money that's not being paid to SARS. What informs that? Because I've never heard that out of Kisweta's mouth.
No, quite literally out of his mouth.
That he's going to go after illicit money, not just tax that isn't, because it seems to me that what he's going to do is going to be to try and get blood out of the same stone that's paying the taxes anyway to the normal taxpayer out there to try and find stuff wherever they can. And I've never heard illicit out of his mouth.
No, quite literally, that is exactly the words that came out of his mouth. The SARS commissioner delivered a presentation to the Standing Committee on Finance. Our member of Action SA in that committee has been working in a constructive manner with the SARS commissioner to understand the dynamics, what's on the table, what can be collected, what might take more time. And we're not talking about squeezing blood out of the stone of law-abiding, honest South Africans who are already paying more tax, let's be clear.
Yeah.
We're talking about squeezing blood out of the stone of people who are evading the law,
Like who?
who aren't paying their taxes, and who are not participating in the system in a legal manner, including the people in the illicit economy. So
Like
from
who?
well, I mean, I don't really know how to respond to that.
No, I'm saying where are these people? You know, I'm flummoxed because we talk about a big number here. He's talking about nearly R1 trillion.
I mean, you're flummoxed by the idea.
That there's money floating around that, you know, much like Shamila Batoy can't get one prosecution, that he's got what his capacity, but yet he can't touch this other nearly trillion rand that's just sitting there. And he knows all about it. But sorry, I just need a little bit more money to get to it.
I don't
understand what it is.
It quite works that way. I think the reality is that there's been a long-term program of gutting SARS,
Right.
Particularly by politically vested interests who have created an economic elite in South Africa in certain corners, who are operating in the illicit economy, who aren't paying taxes and have been shielded by the efforts to cripple what was once a very effective collections unit in SARS, and that now, quite frankly, doesn't live up to that standard any longer. And the SARS commissioner has presented to the Finance Committee to say there's a lot of money on the table. And whatever you read that amount of money to be, whether it's on the low end or the high end of the spectrum, and whatever time frame will take to collect all of that, certainly there's more on the table in the short term than would be required to address the VAT and the income tax increases. And if the SARS commissioner in this country is putting up his hand and saying, I can collect this money, who are we to say that he shouldn't be tasked with the responsibility to go and do so and then held accountable to that standard? Wouldn't it be a wonderful thing, Mike, if we had more senior government officials who stuck their neck out saying, I can do this, back me, and hold me accountable for it afterwards? That's a standard that I think we want to support as a party.
Oh, we would love to. We'd love to. It's just that we are a scarred nation. We've heard one NPA head after the other saying the time for talk is over and we're going to prosecute people, etc. Now I'm hearing the beleaguered, let's say what it is, beleaguered head of SARS, because he got himself into trouble by talking before the finance minister's first budget, where he had to walk back some of his comments. So no, in actual fact, I always had the solution. I just failed to mention it until now. And now suddenly there's this magical money tree that we can shake. It's just down the road there. Just give me more money, we'll get it. Maybe. We'll have to wait and see. But the thing that really worries me, really worries me, is that you mentioned South Africa having its version of Doge, right? We've got this bloated government that is terrifying. South Africa pays, more than double in civil service salaries for any country, our size.
Do you mind if I give you a quick stat in that regard, just to make your point for you? We spend 50 cents in the rand in servicing our debt and 23 cents in the rand in paying for our civil service.
Yeah.
27 cents in the rand is left to fund the priorities of government.
Yeah.
It's a problem.
But now, what guarantees will you extract from government that they'll spend our money better?
Certainly. And I think the key thing to understand is the word guarantees belongs on checks and certain things in politics. I don't think there is such a thing as a guarantee. But we are going to look to extract those kind of reforms, particularly in the form of a spending review. Now, if you look at what has taken place in our country, there is a unit, and a very good unit in the National Treasury, which remains an institution that has been strong in the time in which many have been eroded politically. It's called the Public Expenditure Policy Analysis Unit, PEPA. They have conducted 240 spending reviews since 2013. I don't know if you'd like to take a guess as to how many of those have been implemented, but you can probably imagine how devastating that number would be. And they have calculated 36 billion rand on the table as savings just from efficiencies alone. In other words, efficiencies relating to how they procure, how they interface with other political parties and government, etc. We're not even talking about corruption and maladministration and incompetence, which has cost far more than that figure over many years. And ultimately, we need to see that kind of a spending review taking place and being brought to the South African Parliament, so that this environment where no party has a majority cannot be used to protect these failures of government anymore, but rather the multi-party environment, which is now more competitive and more cutthroat by virtue of that fact, can actually go there and enforce these changes and really see these budget cuts being made, because there's huge amounts of savings that can be made in those regards. And certainly our view is that before you reach into the pockets of South Africans, that's where we need to start cutting first.
Do you intend to do anything about our 700 state-owned companies?
Certainly. We don't think that there's an equation in which we can continue funding the amount of state-owned entities that we do. And I think we need to be real that the vast majority of those 700 aren't really operating in a manner which, from a fiscal point of view is relevant. Really, the major drains on our fiscus come from a handful of those state-owned entities, which are highly problematic, and around which major decisions need to be made. Because if you look at certain entities like the post office in our country, I mean, what public value can we really be referring to there? And even its role in certain regards could be handled by others. Post offices around the world are being done away with because, quite frankly, there are other solutions in those environments that are actually cheaper and more efficient. So, there's a long list of entities like that there needs to be a very serious discussion around. But before we start raising taxes, there need to be fundamental changes to these kind of trends in government where we just bail out and bail out and bail out without those kind of reforms taking place. And if Action SA were to ever contemplate itself in government, that would be one of the reforms we would require.
Yeah, and I see that our production team, has put up our debt clock.
Yeah.
And one can see that thing starts with a 4 and then gets to some very serious numbers thereafter. That is our debt in trillions of rand. That costs us more than R1 million a day, R1 billion a day in interest alone. Now, you are advocating for stability.
Yes.
And that's what 30 years of stability has given us.
Yes.
You are saying instability is a bad thing. Let's just calm down and just keep it going.
No, I'm saying that the South African people shouldn't have to decide whether they want bad stability or bad instability. I don't think we should really regard that to be the bar we're setting in this discussion, Mike. I think that there is a way in which the multi-party environment, which has arisen from these May 2024 elections, can generate a healthy form of competition that changes certain things, like, for example, our debt, which is a huge problem, and works to stabilize that without failing to pass budgets because political parties are using budgets in an irresponsible manner to negotiate political power within the GNU. I don't think we should have to choose between these things. I think the South African people have every right for a government that is actually able to take a responsible approach to that crisis of debt that is taking place, and at the same time provide stability and pass budgets. I think they can do that. And one of the things we have certainly been in discussion with the ANC and other parties is that solutions in that environment need to see the stabilization of our debt firstly, because we have to start there and make sure it doesn't continue to go up and up and up. But over the medium to long term, that number must start coming down. And what we are quite pleased about is there's a responsiveness to that particular crisis, and there appears to be an understanding that this has to be addressed.
Now, I'm confused. Sorry, Michael. We're going to sort of go back to the old chestnut of stability, good, instability, bad. Many people could argue, and we covered it quite closely, that City of Tshwane didn't need the instability of a change of mayor, etc., etc. You have just illustrated that instability brought positive change. The ANC have been arguing for years that what Johannesburg needs is stability, which we've got with Mayor Dada Marero, who promises to do nothing, and he has done nothing. And I'm saying, why are you such a firm defender of stability?
I think we mustn't abuse the word in the process, because stability is not a kind of umbrella under which all of these concepts reside. There is disruptions to a system. And let's talk about the City of Tshwane. We had a multi-party government that was failing in nearly every single metric. And these aren't matters of debate. These are matters of fact. Financially, it was devastated. It was owing 7 billion rand to Eskom while collecting money from residents, by the way. So, definitely not dealing with its obligations in that regard. And the laundry list of failures, including a very concerning pattern of service delivery across that city, really painted a picture that was of serious concern to Action SA.
Okay, then you chose to deliver instability.
One second. We took a decision to disrupt something that was negative.
Okay.
Now, if you disrupt something that's negative, I would venture to you that is a good thing.
So you're
disruption of something negative is a good thing.
Okay, so you're
now
saying
what
that,
I'm going back to deal with your analogy is that if we're going to talk about a budget, I think we can disrupt what is negative and still deliver a budget. I don't think that those are choices. We can have disruptions of negative things that are impacting our country in ways that are all before us and well documented. But we don't have to do it in a manner where the markets and our currency are heavily impacted by a failure to produce a budget on time that communicates the statement of intent of government, and where government departments and people who are dependent on those budgets actually know what they're planning for going forward. I think those are two different things.
Okay. I'm a big fan of the old saying, as jy nie wil luister nie, dan moet jy voel. If you're not going to listen, then you're going to have to feel it. I don't understand your sudden trust that you have in the ANC to respond to angry letters to the editor, whereas 30 years they've done nothing. Now you're saying, guys, no. Let's leave them in power. Let's leave these deployed cadres like Edward Kieswetter, who's going to bail us out. Let's leave it, right? We'll talk them down from their mad positions. We'll talk them down from their VAT and their bracket creep and their bloated expenditure. We'll talk them down. I don't understand your faith. I mean, well, good God, I'm going to be part of your church, boy. You got faith.
Amen. No, let me make this clear. We don't trust any political party in South Africa. And I need to put that on the table. Using words like trust and faith that, quite frankly, have been demonstrated have no place in the political industry. Those aren't the terms to use. And quite frankly, we have experienced almost with every political party we've worked with that we can't trust them and we can't have faith. But ultimately, and I'm afraid to put it in a way that is cynical, it is really about whether you can have mutually aligned interests that deliver a public good, and the ability to see if those interests can align in a way that do address some of these serious issues. Now, before you carried on there, you made a reference to, allowing these guys to continue in these roles, etc. Let me just be clear. Action SA is not in the GNU. I know you know that, but for your viewers, when every other opposition party scrambled for power and vacated the opposition space in favor of their German sedans and corner offices in the Union building, Action SA was the one that says, no, we're going to stay outside because South Africa still needs an opposition. And if the opposition is going to run for power in this kind of way, someone needs to play that role because the EFF and MK have been disasters in opposition. So Action SA has played that role. We're not keeping anybody in power. In fact, if anything, we are the ones keeping them all in check and have done an effective job in so doing. But when it comes to this particular example about the budget, what we are able to see is that if the ANC is in a position where our votes are highly relevant to its ability to pass a budget, we must exact reforms from the ANC that benefit the South African people. That is how political parties in a coalition environment that are responsible must use their powers, and perhaps we wouldn't be in this mess if parties in the GNU had applied that same level of thinking when they were clamoring for their German sedans.
Well, let's just close off by saying that what's happened over the last couple of days will probably trigger, my God, if they don't, it's got to be a political, suicide. It's got to trigger a removal of the Democratic Alliance from the GNU, in which case they join the opposition benches. I'd imagine immediately Cyril Ramaphosa will be shocked. But we understand
something's never changed.
Something's never changed, which means that there's a shortfall in the numbers. It seems like what is happening right now is there's a budding alliance of parties with nothing to lose joining the ANC, i.e. their support is very small, they might as well have a go just on the fact that this works. But what it will probably trigger is a motion of no confidence in our shocked president. What would be the Action SA's position on a motion of no confidence in the leader of the party that got us here?
I think let's just start and go back a second. I really hope you weren't classifying Action SA as a party with nothing to lose. Action SA is by far definitely not the smallest parties in the South African Parliament, and with over 400 and something thousand votes in the last election at a national level, I think that characterization is offensive and unfair for what it's worth. And if you doubt the impact we're having, just look at the events of the last week. Small parties don't get to have that kind of influence. But moving past that for one moment to say a motion of no confidence, like every single other issue that we are dealing with, we would have to deal with it on the merits. It is not currently on the table, so we haven't had any discussions in that regard. But what I will say to you is this, and we're going to go back to the discussion around disruption and instability, I suppose, is that our approach to motions of no confidence at every level is what is the alternative that is going to be put in place. Because if you remove something, you need to know what's going to fill the vacuum. if you would like the analogy of Joburg, it's probably a good example of cheer up, it can get worse. And we don't want to be responsible for creating an environment like that. So we would need to be involved in a discussion around what the alternative would be. Right now, it's very difficult to see what that alternative would be, because the DA has just put itself in the corner with no other options. The EFF and MK are not political parties around which we could align from an economic outlook or other points of view. So it looks like that is not likely to be the solution to the problems in South Africa right now. And the areas that I think we're going to explore is whether or not an arrangement can be put in place that actually resembles a proper coalition with proper power sharing, not what's gone on with this GNU as an implementing agency of the ANC. And if that can't happen, then Action SA will stay out. It's quite important to remember that we didn't call anyone, they called us. And that puts us in a position to see whether there are terms that can be agreed to. And if not, then we're not going to take up that kind of role.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, there is no doubt that Action SA have definitely played their hand extremely strategically. They're in the conversation. We're going to keep Michael here for a few questions from our community. Michael Beaumont, thank you so much for coming at short notice and putting Action SA's case forward. It's always wonderful to speak to you. It's always feisty, and that's the way we like it here. Good luck with what you're doing in the Finance Committee. We can differ on the way we want to see it going, but we do want the best to happen for South Africa. But thank you, and really somebody who's prepared to take on these political battles. To everybody that joined us, support Pace Car Rental. They help keep us keep us going. Support the channel by subscribing, and consider becoming a member. And remember that we're going to have a live event soon with Gayton McKenzie, in actual fact, where we'll be asking him some awkward questions, together with Dr. Frans Cronje at the Sandton Convention Centre on the 16th of April. Consider joining us at that event. But in any case, Michael, thank you so much for joining us.
Just to clarify, would that be a member of State of the Nation or a member of Action SA?
They can do both.
Excellent.
Yeah. Thank you all for joining us today. We'll see you again on the State of the Nation. Thank you.